Welcome to the contemporary review of the primary institutions of business and industry. This review represents the third primary institutional group we will examine. While it is not as emotionally integrated into our social fabric as religion, literary, legal, and civic institutions may be, it is nevertheless a powerful group interacting and exerting influence upon our culture and our lives. As there's a lot to be covered, we will be breaking 6C into two parts. Within our prevailing culture, the influence and contribution of the major companies and organizations which drive and impact our economy are instrumentally wedded to the health and well-being of our overall society. In Part 1, we will explore the deep and oftentimes complex relationship the institutions of business and industry has in our personal lives, as well as the nation itself and our financial and business world. In business and industry, we find the expression of value decay in the actions of companies and in the leadership boardrooms, especially in how some have corrupted our economy with greed and unrestrained self-interest. Wall Street and other financial institutions play a most necessary and vital role in our nation's economy engine, along with government investment and oversight. Together they form an essential complexity of interwoven institutions and financial processes that define our economy and desired vitality. It is, nonetheless, a role and purpose which requires structure, and institutions which are firmly grounded to stable systems, along with competent people tied to discipline and ethical practices. Otherwise, our economic train can quickly jump the tracks, with disastrous consequences for the nation. It has happened before in small ways and in big. Sometimes it's a slow burn over months and years. Other times, it can happen in a moment, over days and even hours, with a train wreck that takes its toll in human livelihood and untold treasures of billions. As we review the institutions of business and industry, we do so from a macro view, considerate of all those processes and structures too numerous and complicated to examine and explain individually. Our viewpoint mostly focuses on the people in business and their activities in our economic capitalist system, listening to what they've said or say, or even more closely watching what they do or have done, holding them accountable for the decisions they've made or failed to make, understanding the consequences of actions they've taken or failed to take. We are observant of the right and wrong choices they make, and cognizant of the characteristic motivations driving their thinking, decisions, and judgments. We have seen their personas reflected in their computer programs, algorithms, artificial intelligence, derivatives, and EFTs. And we eventually see how these decisions and actions have affected people downstream from their involvement, and how their designs entered on Wall Street materialize on Main Street and energized economies or stagnant momentum or outright disaster. When we look at our institutions in business and industry, and we peer into our contemporary culture using the optics of common sense and simple morality, we see a lot of good. While the American economy is the greatest in the world and has been for nearly a century, and it has funded democracy and restructure over much of that world, through wars and peace providing leadership and development to both the strong and impoverished. We also see things which are not so good. Over the past number of years, we observed unsettling signals emerging in the institutions of business and industry, which, left unchecked, are going to cause more hardship for the American people. In fact, we have seen, and do see, troubling indications of greed expressing over rightful and ethical behavior, which, if not reversed, will lead us into a deeper financial uncertainty, if not ruin. We see self-interest being pursued, absent of societal concern, absent of genuine morality, absent of conscience and community-mindedness. We see the hand of relative morality spreading its greasy clutch around the throat of those important institutions, the people who run them, and the million of innocent lives who depend upon them. We experienced several serious economic downturns over the past few decades. Some were slow in their making, others were upon us in a whirlwind. Yet each of them exhaled damaging consequences upon average Americans and their families. Lost income, lost jobs, personal debt, bankruptcy. Economic downturns cause destruction and misery in our culture. Let's take a look at some real and relevant things influencing and happening in business. Corruption of Wall Street finances, creating the Great Recession of 2008. The outsourcing of American jobs and intellectual property offshore and into other nations. The creation of sustained high unemployment, pushing many out of the U.S. labor force, especially the youth. Companies simply losing strategic and ethic focus. Business leaders soaking their shareholders. A consequence backlash against capitalism amongst the young. And the ever-present growing organized crime penetrating legitimate businesses here in America and globally. In order to gain a realistic view of what drives and changes our business and industries, let's take a look at what's been happening in the American economy. A relevant place to start is on Wall Street, where you can find the heart of American and global business institutions plying their trade: investment banking, stock trading, financial systems management, treasuries, money markets, and so on. And of greater significance, the people behind the machines and the financial activities who make the whole system rise and fall. Here on Wall Street, as we've said before, one can find both good and bad occurring in regular frequency. And it's here that the circulatory system of American industry starts and ends. Either the bull is running or the bear is sleeping. Wall Street is the nexus of the money market, and the decisions made on Wall Street largely determines the course of our economy. And as they say, when Wall Street sneezes, America catches a cold. And we've experienced some fairly big colds. Why, just a few years ago, the headlines after 2008 dealt with the financial meltdown on Wall Street, stemming from a mortgage crisis and triggering undercapitalized financial powerhouses, tripping them up with collapsing financial bets that they had played. The financial meltdown mushroomed, infecting all U.S. institutions and then quickly fanning across the globe, destabilizing highly leveraged financial markets everywhere. Upon close examination of what happened on Wall Street after the financial crisis exploded, we learned what we've always known. A Wall Street business culture once again revealed in action and behavior of financial titans, typified the unmitigated greed, brazen dishonesty, and the arrogance of power. Wall Street has a culture of its own creation, a culture where the old and the young are geared towards making money at all at any cost. Their pursuit of riches is many times not contained by what is lawful or right, or even by what is reasonable or moral. It's a culture of rapacious gluttony, a culture of clever intrigue, and at times outright theft. A culture without loyalty to principles, a culture rife with deception and at times outright thievery, extreme and single-minded in its nature, to relentlessly pursue money, like a hyena after its prey, vicious and unforgiving, by whatever means necessary, by whatever trickery devised, anything and everything, unmitigated in its impulse, driven to reach its mark. Of the hundreds of financial titans on Wall Street and the many thousands of investment bankers, traders, stockbrokers, and others who swell the ranks of our capitalist system, keeping economies going, growing, churning, and burning, it only takes a few well-placed crooks to disrupt our capitalist system, a few pigs at the trough. Nowadays, the financial systems are incredibly interconnected, interwoven with risk-sharing and complex derivatives, making for a delicate balance between perceived financial health and financial disaster. And the bad, when they're discovered, if they get discovered that is, are truly found to be despicable. Some call them out simply as a bunch of crooks, which is one way of putting it, relentlessly feeding themselves at America's dinner table without regard for any interest but their own. Financial training by career and relative morality by character and action. And when disaster struck in 2008, triggered by a Wall Street crisis of reckless, consumptive greed, insolvent mortgage securities, unstable derivatives, stock bubbles, and the like, weakened capital bases and exposed leverages, extending across the world with near collapse of global financial markets. The U.S. government was called upon at that time to bail out the thieves, and that plan was soundly rejected. Sentiment was against the bankers. Yet the government had to step in to avoid a domino collapse of our economy, so it rightly did. Emergency measures were undertaken by George W. Bush and his staff in the fall of 2008, and they carried them into 2009 with Barack Obama picking up the responsibility as he took office. The greed on Wall Street led to suffering on Main Street in every town in America. The Great Recession of 2008 descended upon the country, enveloping our society in a crushing economic squeeze, with painful impact to nearly every citizen and family born or yet to be born. Mounting worry, misery, and loss, businesses foreclosed, people out of work, loss of homes, swelling food banks and shelters, added millions on food stamps and entitlements. 94 million are forced out of the labor force due to lack of jobs. The pressure on the country's economic situation exposes fissures of concern in many of the states. The nation's bleak economic picture forces closer scrutiny of state and local finances. It quickly acknowledged our states and many city governments are facing serious financial shortfalls. Many have been overspending their resource base for years, catering to special interest concerns, doomed by their weak political leadership and incompetent liberal financial mismanagement. Aside from the Great Recession and growing debts, we see compounding concerns in the corporate boardrooms seeking to achieve lower cost structures and competitiveness with China's power of price. Outsourcing is often a strategic direction they choose by shifting their assets and sourcing offshore and investing in developing countries. Trillions leave U.S. banks and industry only to be siphoned up by currency manipulators and economic sharks, or held in remote foreign banks to avoid a 35% corporate tax in America, the highest in the world. With all the outsourcing going on over 3.5 decades, the cumulative impact of job loss adds up. Since 1980, over 7 million manufacturing jobs have simply vanished, leaving communities across the nation with shuttered-up factories and pushing hard-working folks into financial anguish and dismal futures. America's manufacturing base has been evaporating, and it's recreated in China, India, Mexico, and elsewhere. American treasure leaks out to other nations, damning our prosperity and enriching theirs. One important measure of our economic health is the youth unemployment rate, and during the past decade it hasn't been good until recently. Youth unemployment in the U.S. averages 12.27% from 1955 until 2017. It reached an all-time high of 19.5% in April of 2010. For most of the Obama presidency, youth unemployment remained high, nearly twice as bad for minorities as whites. And since Trump, the numbers have really started improving. Youth unemployment rate in the U.S. decreased to 9.1% in March of 2017. Another measure of fiscal health is the United States labor force participation rate. We have not seen much progress on this rate since the highs in the Obama administration, but it's moving in the right direction, which is down, reflecting improvement, an indication more jobless workers who are not counted in the unemployment index the Feds post are re-entering the workforce. Another characteristic of an ailing business culture to take note of is when big businesses blatantly cheat and deceive their customers. Perhaps you heard of Enron back in the exuberant 90s, a $70 billion company which deceived thousands of investors in phony investment scams, only to be discovered, and the management subsequently prosecuted. And the company itself, along with its shareholders, were wiped out, as the business failed in the early 2000s, essentially losing tens of billions. Every year, many hundreds of dishonest businessmen cook up phony companies to scam people. Most of them are eventually found out and caught before they do too much harm. However, like Enron, it's unsettling to the business culture when a big company that is heavily involved in the financial relations across the nation engage in fraud. Wells Fargo is another recent example where over 5,000 employees had to be fired in 2016 for dishonest practices in setting up phony accounts for extra personal compensation. And another glaring example of greed surfaced recently in the U.S. business culture, as the reviled Martin Shkreli, CEO of Truing Inc., with arrogance and smugness, unilaterally raised prices on vital cancer, newborn, and HIV drugs. Not just a little bit, mind you, but astronomically, pushing needful customers dependent upon the drugs for survival out into the cold of night. And when caught and interviewed, he is true to form, with a repulsive elitist ego, not willing to recognize the hardship he was creating. He instead coughs up a drivel of delusional rationalization. And not long after, the CEO of Malin, another pharmaceutical giant, is publicly called to task. You see, Malin purchased Merck's generics units in early 2007, and over the next 9 years, consecutively raised the price of EpiPens, generally used for emergency dispensing of medicines to reverse life-threatening allergy attacks. Malin consequently pushes the price up from $100 per unit to $600 in steady, regular increases, pushing many needy patients out of affordability. The CEO, Heather Bresch, is taken over hot coals by the media and lawmakers for such heartless, if not selfish, business practices. And then we have a different color of corporate misdirection, courtesy of Target stores. Rather than staying on focus with rebuilding their sales after a massive security breach a few years ago, the corporate board of Target selects to get into the political correctness melees of the Obama administration, opting to leverage what they see as an opportunity to ride the social justice bandwagon. They clumsily institute a poorly thought out bathroom policy for transgenders, catering to a micro special interest group for liberal progressive points, at the expense of parents and young children, the majority of their consuming population base. Big business has long been known to target your children with alluring ads, manipulative themes, humor, animal characters, and the like. The big advertising agencies, prodded by the manufacturers and retailers, continuously devise new methods for captivating the young minds into wanting what they don't need and can do without. Many times unhealthy foods, dangerous toys, or expensive mindless electronics and violent games. For these companies, targeting the most innocent and vulnerable among us is open territory to their amoral executives. In the world's most powerful economy, America, for a country beset by years of economic recession, job loss, bankruptcy, personal debt, fraud, and the consequential human misery, for a country with top business executives fixated on short-term profit gain, with executive compensation programs perversely tied to their short-term results as opposed to strategic long-term performance and steady growth, does anyone ever peel back the cover and seek to determine the causal reasons for the dark, persistent behaviors in our financial world? When we look at executive compensation programs, we see CEO compensation levels completely out of sync as compared with compensation growth for their workers. Going back to the late 1980s, we see things starting to get out of control, and the gap mushrooms thereafter. Big business has been rewarding top executives in a perverse formula that encourages short-term perspective instead of long-term strategic direction. Just to emphasize the extent of imbalance between CEO compensation and their corresponding worker, this chart shows the number of hours a full-time minimum wage employee would need to work to equal a single hour of the CEO for the named company. Stunning, isn't it? And improperly occurring. It's out of balance and genuinely unfair. And if market forces cannot bring it into correction, then our economic system is truly broken. Another indicator of the depth of weak moral culture in our business world is when the worst crooks are people we have come to deeply trust with our hard-earned money. And then the swindle happens, despite strong, clear warning signs to federal regulators and others. So is the recent case for the billionaire financial investor named Bernie Madoff, along with some of his slippery friends and Wall Street cronies. They choose to spend years defrauding and cheating their trusting clients and marginalizing critics to hide their criminality, all the while stealing their clients' life savings and retirement monies. Essentially, Madoff and his friends defrauded the clients out of an incredible amount of money, totaling by most accounts up to $65 billion, the most ever stolen in U.S. history by such scheming. Madoff swallows up these monies like a swollen pig at the feeding trough, pumping billions into a giant Ponzi scheme of his own making, enriching his closest friends and partners at the top of the pyramid. and laying ruin to thousands of lives who face lost retirement monies and precious nest eggs across America in hundreds of zip codes. Families learn their hard-earned savings have been wiped out. Why, you might ask? The answer is simple. These things are entirely possible in a culture motivated by greed, dishonesty, and frenetic pursuit of more money. And in addition to shattering those individual lives, Madoff's elaborate scheme entangles many financial institutions across the business world, inflicting deep loss in pensions and corporate investments accounts of banks and other institutions. Again, and we stress, in the billions. All during a time where recession and distress is already haunting the world's economy, expanding hardship and hurt to many millions and a wide extensional impact of their crimes. Eventually, Madoff is later caught, tried, and deservedly sent to jail, sentenced to 150 years to serve the rest of his life in prison. Madoff is certainly one of the worst, yet the financial investment world is full of such scandals and creeps behind them. Although there are many legitimate people in the financial investment trade, there's plenty of rats crawling around the business, and it's these types of people who have and continue to contribute to our economic's instability and an enduring distrust by common Americans. This ends Part 1. Please go to the next presentation, 6C Part 2, as we continue with our assessment of business and industry in America today.